Coming up on today's edition of the Locked On Raiders podcast, I'll continue to highlight players from the Raiders 2023 NFL draft class. And this time I'm going to go back to the first-round pick, Tyree Wilson, because Chris Level hosts a Locked On Texas Tech. He's also the sideline reporter for the Red Raiders program. He's going to join the show to talk all things Tyree Wilson, drop a few nuggets about him, give us a little bit more of a deep dive on the first-round pick. So he'll join the show, and, of course, news and notes around the NFL and news and notes around the Silver and Black. It's all coming up on Wednesday's edition of the Locked On Raiders podcast, May 3rd, 2023.
Just win. Just win. Just win. Just win.
The autumn wind is a raider, pillaging just for fun. He'll knock you round and upside down and laugh when he's conquered and won. And won. And won. And won. And won.
And welcome in, Raider Nation, to another edition of the Locked On Raiders podcast. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen of the day. Make sure you subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts to get the latest edition of the show as soon as it drops. And, of course, if you're checking us out on YouTube, that's because my man Ari has us up on YouTube each and every day. We definitely appreciate him. You can check him out on Twitter at Ari Produces. And we appreciate you as well, Raider Nation, for checking us out for a minute, 30 minutes, whatever the case may be. We definitely appreciate that. So before we get into the conversation with Chris Level, and he drops an interesting nugget in this conversation about how Tyree Wilson polices the locker room. Yes, Tyree Wilson, not a man of many words, polices the locker room. Just a little bit of a nugget, a little bit of a tease to look forward to the conversation I had with Chris Level. That's coming up in segments number 2 and segment number 3. But want to get into news and notes here in segment number 1. And it's funny, as I was at the Intermountain Healthcare Performance Center on Tuesday, myself and JT the Brick were recording the Raider Roundtable show along with Rhett Lewis from the NFL Network, and it was going really well. It's funny, we have our phones turned upside down, so just in case it goes off, like it's not distracting, we don't see it, or you don't see it on camera or whatever like that. So we have our phones flipped upside down. And that's what I do when I'm in meetings anyway. If I even take my phone to the meeting, I just think it's kind of disrespectful to always be checking out your phone. I should actually find a way to do that at home more often. Then I wouldn't be on Twitter, or I wouldn't be on my phone in general, and really be able to spend some time with the family and actually, have some kind of communication. I should learn to turn my phone upside down at home. But that's a me problem, right? I got to work that out. But that's what we did in the Intermountain Healthcare Performance Center while we were recording the Raiders Roundtable, and we kept hearing and feeling our phones. You know when your phone's vibrating and you can just feel it going off and you're trying to stop it? It just kept going off, but it wasn't ringing. It was just, and it felt like it was going off every few seconds. We're like, what the hell's going on? And so finally, when we get into a break, we broke it down into like 3 segments as the Raider Roundtable. And when we finally get into one of the breaks, we turn over our phone and I just see all these notifications on it. And it was the fact that former Raider wide receiver Henry Ruggs is planning to plead guilty in his case, obviously the case where he got the DUI or is accused of the DUI, and of course accused in the incident that ultimately killed Tina Tintor and her dog here in Las Vegas. Well, it came out first from Adam Schefter, and then it just, like I said, caught like wildfire. So here's some of the release from Adam Schefter put up on ESPN.com. He said, former Raiders receiver Henry Ruggs unconditionally waived his right to a preliminary hearing Tuesday and will plead guilty to 1 count of DUI resulting in death and 1 count of misdemeanor vehicular manslaughter in a 2021 case in which he's accused of killing a woman in a car crash. Again, that's Tina Tintor and her dog. And then it goes on to say, according to a plea agreement presented Tuesday in Las Vegas Justice Court, Ruggs will serve 3 to 10 years in Nevada State Prison. The case now moves to the 8th Judicial District Court for a hearing on May 10th when he's expected to formally plead guilty. The judge asked him if he understood what was going on in the proceedings, and he replied, "Yes, Your Honor." So there you go. Former Raider wide receiver Henry Ruggs next week plans to plead guilty in the case, but of course it's been plead down. It's been a plea bargain. So the charges that were dropped as part of the plea deal were 1 count of DUI, causing substantial harm regarding his passenger, and 2 counts of reckless driving. And so one of the attorneys for Ruggs said this is the first step toward a fair resolution to this matter, and we look forward to closure for all parties involved. And the thing I'll say about this, and I'm not here to judge Henry Ruggs. He's a young man that made a terrible mistake that he's got to live with for the rest of his life. And there's plenty of us that have been in that position and made terrible decisions that we ultimately have to, live with the rest of our lives. One way, one how, right? It doesn't matter what it is, but that's something for Henry Ruggs. So I'm not going to be the guy, the judge, the jury, and the executioner and say, oh, that's great for him. I'm not going to say that's bad for him. I'm just going to say that is what he's working out. So he, again, going back to the report, is facing 3 to 10 years in prison. And I'm assuming, and this is just an assumption on my part, and of course it's always terrible to assume, but with his high-priced lawyers that he has, I'm assuming that his sentence is going to be closer to 3 years than it will 10 years. But that's basically what he's facing coming up next week on May 10th when the hearing gets started. And the preliminary hearings were rescheduled 6 times. The last delay came in March over which justice of the peace should handle the hearing. And in that case, if it had been convicted, Ruggs had faced a minimum of 2 years and up to 50 years in prison. So obviously, this is a much lighter sentence that we're all expecting for him to get, either 3 years or 10 years. That's not going to change anything for the family of Tina Tintor. That's not going to bring her life back, which ultimately sucks. And I know Henry Ruggs probably feels terrible about that as well. Obviously, his life has been changed upside down. His family's lives have been changed upside down. It's just an all bad situation all around. Like I said, I'm not going to be here the one to, throw stones at him. Not going to, try to, not praise him, that's the wrong word, but celebrate him either. It's just, again, it's something that sucks. And ultimately, a young lady lost her life. But that was the latest and the greatest right there when it comes to Henry Ruggs and his situation. And haven't really talked about Henry Ruggs too often because there really wasn't a whole lot. Like I said, the preliminary hearing was rescheduled 6 times. So you could tell it's just been kind of kicked down the road, kicked down the road, kicked down the road. And on Tuesday was the first real clarity of what's going to happen. Now, on to a much lighter note, there was a lot of rumors floating around Twitter on Tuesday about the Raiders and Bills are going to be playing in London in 2023. Now, the NFL regular season schedule release is supposed to be next week. That's May 11th, which is actually the day after the Henry Ruggs case gets going. But that's when the regular season schedule is supposed to be released, and I thought that they were going to release the international games ahead of that. So I think if it's on the 11th, which I believe is Thursday, I think that they'll release the international games on Wednesday. So maybe the 10th, maybe they'll do it on the 9th, one of those days. But, the Bills are a team that's going to be hosting at Tottenham Stadium. So the rumor is that it's going to be the Ravens at the Jaguars on October 29th. That's at Wembley Stadium. The Raiders at the Bills at Tottenham Stadium on October 8th. And then the Panthers at the Titans at Tottenham Stadium. And that's October 15th. Those aren't confirmed. Those are just what's been floating around Twitter on Tuesday. So kind of take it with a grain of salt, but just know that there's a potential that the Raiders will be playing in London. And we knew that there was already a potential that they could be playing, in international game in 2023. But the good thing is it's not a home game. It's an away game. So all their home games they will have in 2023. There won't be any international games that are going to take a home game away. This is a Buffalo Bills home game. So just wanted to pass that little nugget right there. And the final little nugget I have for you for segment number 1 of today's Locked On Raiders podcast, kind of news and notes of the day. I've mentioned on this show Peter King and the article that he wrote about being in the Raiders war room on Thursday, the first day of the NFL draft. Well, he was actually a guest on the morning tailgate on Raider Nation Radio 920 on Tuesday with Vinny Bonsignore, Clay Baker, and Lindsey Brown. And a really good conversation. It was about 25 minutes long. If you want to hear the whole conversation, go to lvsportsnetwork.com. Check it out. Really, really good stuff. But, the one thing I've appreciated about this staff, Dave Ziegler and Josh McDaniels, and I know all Raider Nation is not big fans of the guys, and that's fine. I'm not here to convince you that, you should be a fan of them. Look, whatever you want to do is whatever you want to do. I'm fine with that. But the one thing that has stood out to me since they took over, and especially even Josh McDaniels, really, because obviously I talk to him more and I see him more, is that he embraces being a Raider, right? I mean, remember that game against Seattle where Seattle had a guy come in off the sideline after an interception and ran onto the field, and, the next media session that we had with them, we asked him about it, and Josh McDaniels was like, Psh, we're the Raiders. What do you expect? Remember the Hall of Fame game when it was a tip of the cap to Cliff Branch when the very first play of the game, he had Jarrett Stidham try to go deep as a tip of the cap to Cliff Branch. I mean, he's done that. There's been times where you could tell that he just really embraces being a Raider, and I can appreciate that, right? As a lifelong Raider fan, I can appreciate someone that embraces who the Raiders are, and not just some guy that comes in from the New England Patriots and forget the Raiders. It's all about me, and it's all about what I want to do. It just hasn't felt that way. Well, Peter King was telling the morning tailgate on Tuesday about an interesting little nugget when he was in the war room and when he was headed to the war room with Dave Ziegler and Josh McDaniels. And he points out something, and he's talking about Ziegler and McDaniels being the keepers of the flame. And what does he mean by that? Obviously, that's the Al Davis Memorial flame, the torch that's out front of the Intermountain Healthcare Performance Center, the Raiders headquarters here in Henderson. So, he's talking about that, but just listen to what he says about Dave Ziegler and what he says about Al Davis and what he does when he walks by a huge photo of Al Davis at the facility. I thought this was really cool. Check it out.
It has to be hard when you are you're sort of the keeper of the flame, as sort of Dave Ziegler is right now and Josh McDaniels. They're trying to bring the Raiders back to what Al had. And I noticed when Ziegler that afternoon passed the big, huge portrait, there's a picture of it in my column, of Al Davis right outside the draft room. When Ziegler was passing it, he put his hand on it, and he patted it, and he just stopped for a minute. And I just said, I said, that's kind of cool. And he goes, I passed this, and I get goosebumps. And he said, I understand what the job is. And he said, I don't necessarily think that Al and I would have everything in common, but he said the one thing we have in common is that I think we're both able to make decisions without worrying about the public perception of those decisions. And obviously, Ziegler learned that under Bill Belichick. But I do think that there's a lot of decisions Al made in his career that he got tremendous amount of guff for all the way to the end, all the way to decisions like Jamarcus Russell. But he just wasn't going to change who he was. And I think that Dave Ziegler will pick players on his merits and on their merits, and use his own years of football to try to make a decision about who works. And I know because I got a ton of this on social media and in letters to my column. Are you kidding me? They were considering Anton Harrison at 12. I mean, that's ridiculous. It's awful. These guys don't know what they're doing. And I just said, look, I responded to one letter, and I said, read the item in my column about the 2020 draft, okay? And the 2020 draft, there's only 8 players in that draft who you would legitimately call stars. And I said maybe, and Joe Burrow obviously is one, and Justin Herbert, but I said maybe the next best one was picked, whatever Justin Jefferson was, 23rd,
right,
22nd. I mean, in the draft, you have to trust what you think. And that's really what I think the Raiders are doing right now. And they're not going to get really caught up in everybody saying, what are you guys, a bunch of boobs for, making this value judgment over somebody else? Or why didn't you just stay where you were and just get Sanders? He would have been a great player to need position. And so they're going to do it the way they want it. And look, we'll all know if it doesn't work out in 3 years, Mark Davis will be looking for other people. That's the way the business works.
So there was, again, you don't have to be a fan of the staff, the GM, the head coach. And I think most of Raider Nation is cool with the GM. I think a lot of people are still skeptical on the head coach, and I think that's fine. That is absolutely fine, right? I mean, like I keep saying, I'm just going to give him a chance, right? His record is not where anyone wants it to be, including him. And now that he's turned the roster over and the staff and Dave Ziegler and company have turned the roster over, now there is no excuses. And I know Raider Nation hates to hear no excuses, but there's no excuses why they can't go get it done. You've got your guys in place. You've been in place for over a year now, so now you should be able to go out there and thrive. I'll tell you right now, just looking at the team on paper, the offense should be really good. The defense, it's got to obviously step up. A lot of these players that they've selected and they brought in free agency have got to step up, right? So I don't expect it to be, the 85 Bears and the lockdown defense or anything like that, but it's got to be a lot better than it was in 2022. If it can, then this team could be a successful team. But I think there's a lot of pressure on Josh McDaniels to get it right and figure it out and be a really good coach. If not, at some point, it's going to be like, hey, dude, what's the problem? Patrick Graham, same thing on the defensive side of things. If you complain that you didn't have the players to get your defense executed in the way that you wanted to, okay, well, they went out and got you some guys. Now you've got to make it work. So I think there's a lot of pressure on the coaching staff, and I think that Dave Ziegler is doing everything he can to supply them with what they need to go get the job done. But that little nugget from Peter King on Dave Ziegler just embracing, Al Davis and, tapping the picture and just saying that, that kind of gives him goosebumps when he sees it. Like, I think that one is genuine. That's who Dave Ziegler is. But I think that that's just awesome, an awesome little nugget from Peter King. And that's what you get when you have a guy that's in the war room like Peter King, who could give you a very detailed explanation of what was going on. And again, he was on with the Morning Tailgate for 25 minutes. I thought it was some really good stuff. You want to hear that interview, go to lvsportsnetwork.com. FanDuel.com. Coming up next, how about we deep dive into that first-round draft pick, Tyree Wilson out of Texas Tech. Chris Level, host of Locked On Texas Tech, he'll join the show to deep dive into all things Tyree Wilson and give you a little bit more background on the young man from East Texas. That's going to come up after I tell you about FanDuel. And I don't know how much you're checking out of the NBA playoffs, but the Lakers and Warriors, I'm assuming it's going to be a great series. We saw what happened in Game 1, a lot of good stuff. The New York Knicks and the Miami Heat, that's a fun series. That's all knotted up at 1. Right now is a perfect time to make a fast break to FanDuel during the NBA playoffs. New customers can get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's $1,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. So whatever the case may be, if you want to have a player prop bet, you can. If you want to bet the total, you can. If you want to bet an over-under on whatever the case may be, you can do it at FanDuel. There's no better place to bet on all the playoff action than America's #1 sportsbook. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon. Get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. And here we go, Raider Nation. Segment number 2 of today's Locked On Raiders podcast. Time to let you hear this conversation that I had with Chris Level, host of Locked On Texas Tech, and hopefully you really enjoy this. I mean, this guy is really good. He's a sideline reporter for the Red Raiders as well, so he's up close and personal. He sees everything going on behind the bench and really had a great idea of who Tyree Wilson is. Now, of course, I've talked to his head coach, Joey McGuire. I've talked to multiple guys, all things Tyree Wilson, but this was really kind of the ultimate deep dive into who the first-round pick for the Silver and Black is. So here's that conversation, at least part 1 of the conversation with Chris Level, host of Locked On Texas Tech. Joining us now to talk all things Tyree Wilson, the young man out of Texas Tech, number 7 overall pick by the Silver and Black, is Chris Level, host of Locked On Texas Tech, and you can find him on Twitter at Locked On Tech. That's where you can find the show. And Chris, thanks so much for your time. It's funny, man. It's like we kind of go back and didn't even realize we go back. We go back to my old ESPN Central Texas days. So it's kind of like a little reunion we got going here on the show today.
That's right. You're a Texan at heart, and I knew when you said "young man," you were talking about Tyree and not me. But I no slight at all. But yeah, fun to talk about. Such a cool guy and a great story. When he gets drafted 7th overall, I think the Raiders ended up with a phenomenal human and football player.
Yeah, I agree. And I had head coach Joey McGuire on the show not too long ago just to talk and give a little bit of background on Tyree. And, one of the things that stood out to me is he just said that the guy's motor, he's one of those guys where the motor just does not quit. When you watched Tyree and you saw how he helped that Texas Tech defense really develop, is that what stood out to you the most? And what can you tell us about just the way he goes into it game in and game out?
Well, what stands out to me about Tyree, and I think Texas Tech, Joey would tell you the same thing, what Texas Tech will miss most from Tyree is just his presence. This is a big human. And I just think he carries himself, one, because he's so good, but when you're so good and you're just that big, and the NFL is a measurables league. We all get it. But when you're 6'6 plus, 275, and you play as hard as he does, I mean, it's just like you check every box. And I think that's what sticks out to me the most is how big he is, but also how hard he plays. And I'll tell you a few stories this is why we're having this conversation, honestly, because this is why he was picked and thought to be in this kind of top 10 range, is because this is a guy that whenever NFL folks would come through, and look, they come in the spring ball and they come in August and they're kind of, getting the lay of the land at all these colleges, trying to figure, scouts from all over. And what Joey would show them, and it wouldn't matter the week, okay? So it didn't matter if you were there on August the 10th or September the 17th or October the 25th. He would show them like a Tuesday practice film, and this is a guy chasing people down 20 yards down the field if they ran a screen pass away from him, and he's beating people down the field, across the field, and playing extremely hard. And it doesn't matter that it's not a Saturday afternoon. This is just how he rolls. And I think that his motor is something that's why he's so difficult to block. He's not perfect. Right, but I think when you talk about there's some things he can work on technically, and he's a bit raw at times and all that. But the measurables and the motors are something you simply cannot teach. You just can't do it.
And that's the thing about it. And again, we're talking with Chris Level here, host of Locked On Texas Tech, talking all things Tyree Wilson. That's one of the things that stood out to me about him and really the whole Raiders draft class was the fact that these are guys that have production, and Tyree has production, back-to-back years of 7 sacks seasons there at Texas Tech, but he also has room to grow. Like, he hasn't reached that ceiling yet. And so that's what kind of gets me excited about the young man, is that he has an opportunity to grow and get better, and he also has the want to continue to do that. And he even said that he wanted to come to Vegas and get his iPad and get with the coaching staff. It's all about business coming to Vegas. It wasn't like, I want to see the lights, I want to see the glamour and all that. I just want to get down to business. Seems like he's very focused on what he's doing and the job at hand.
I think you've nailed it on the part about, look, there was this argument before the draft, whether they're different players, but they kind of play the same position depending on scheme. But everybody kind of started to compare Tyree and Will Anderson, and I think that, Tyree is very much has a lot of room to go. And I don't think you've seen anywhere near how good he can be. And that's scary. I think, and I don't want to say that Will Anderson doesn't have room to grow, but you
right.
could make the argument that he's a finished product. This is what he is. Now, that finished product is pretty darn good, but right. I think Tyree has got a lot of room to grow, and depending on how he's utilized and all those things. But he doesn't say a whole lot. This is not somebody that's loud and boisterous and all that. And I'll tell you, he's an alpha, but he doesn't get into it with his teammates. He doesn't cause problems. He's kind of a vibe guy in that they all look at him because of how big he is and how hard he plays, and they want to emulate, and he leads by example. But like, if a guy wasn't practicing as hard, or just wasn't practicing because, okay, my knee's a little hurt, or man, my ankle's sore, whatever it may be, if Tyree felt like they were kind of trying to maybe take a day off, he'd go in the locker room and that nameplate came down and ended up in his locker. And
wow.
And he didn't say a whole lot. There was never a scuffle, but guys on that team knew, like, oh no, like I've screwed up, and that's
right. I've stirred it up.
yes. But it's because, and nobody could tell Tyree anything differently, because
right.
he's there every day. He is busting it every day. And we saw him go down in the Kansas game, and that's when he injured the foot. And right. So you look at the stat number. If he plays the final 3 games, I think the sack number is higher. But we're in Ames, Iowa, and I do the sideline stuff for Texas Tech football on the radio side, and it's 0 degrees. It is just miserable, and he has just been hurt the week before. The dude is out there in like a sleeveless vest. He's out there with his teammates, and he's on crutches and everything just because he loves it. And right. If it's me, I'm at home under a blanket, and like I'm like, hey, good luck, fellas, you got it. I'll watch it on TV. Not that guy. He was standing right there next to us. I've got on everything that I own, and he's out there with a sleeveless vest on, because that's what it meant to him. And I just think it said a lot about Tyree, and Texas Tech went on to win that game in a close one. But Tyree, again, his presence means a lot, man. I'm just telling you, it's just he's a fun guy to be around.
It sounds like it, right? It sounds like an absolute alpha dog, as you mentioned. Again, we're talking all things Tyree Wilson with Chris Level here. And the thing about it is, the whole nameplate, that to me, I mean, that made my eyes open up real wide and my ears perked up. I mean, how long has he been doing that, or how long was he doing that there at Texas Tech while he was, taking down the nameplate if you weren't doing what you're supposed to be doing?
I think the latter part of what would have been his second season here, and then all last year.
Wow.
The light really came on for Tyree here, because people may not realize this, but he showed up to Tech. So he's been here 3 seasons. He showed up to Texas Tech from Texas A&M, well documented. But he shows up in kind of mid to late July. Camp is about to start, and he had built a relationship up with Keith Patterson and Paul Randolph, who was, Paul Randolph, I think, is the defensive line coach at University of Indiana. Keith Patterson is the head coach at Abilene Christian. And then obviously Matt Wells was the head coach at the time. They got him to walk on. So this gives you and look, he had
Wow.
plenty of scholarship offers
Yeah.
in the SEC. I mean, all those things, but he wanted to be in Texas. There was something about being fairly close to home, being in Texas, and Texas Tech had already given up all their scholarships, so they were over. So they're like, dude, get here, hang in here for a semester. We'll get you on scholarship, in the spring. Well, he does this. But it took a bit because he's kind of out of shape. He wasn't in football shape yet because he missed the entire offseason, shows up, gets thrown into it in camp. And so we saw flashes, but it wasn't until the following season that, boy, you could go, okay, this dude is different. And it was that bowl game versus Mike Leach, ironically enough.
Right.
He has back-to-back sacks over Will Rogers in that game. And the defense just stonewalled Mike's offense that day, and Tyree had as much to do with it as anybody. And that's kind of where you started to hear, okay, NFL draft, first round. The lights really started to come on. He's kind of figured out his body's right. He's healthy. And then this past year, it's just been nothing but fun being around him.
So there was part one of our conversation right there, talking all things Tyree Wilson. Coming up in segment number 3, we'll close things out with part 2, continue to do a little bit of deep dive and get some more nuggets, some nice little nuggets from Chris Level, host of Locked On Texas Tech. And it's so funny knowing Chris for a long time, man. As you heard early in the segment, I used to have him on my radio show on ESPN Central Texas. So I thought that was really cool that we were able to be able to have that conversation about Tyree Wilson. But coming up in segment number 3, you'll hear part 2 of that conversation here on the Locked On Raiders podcast. Here we go, Raider Nation. Segment number 3 of today's Locked On Raiders podcast. Time to jump into part 2 of my conversation with Chris Level, host of Locked On Texas Tech, talking all things Tyree Wilson, the first round draft pick of the Silver and Black, number 7 overall. Here's a really good conversation, part 2 of that conversation with Chris Level. Chris, you've been covering Texas Tech long enough, and you've seen a lot of Big 12 action as well. How rare is it that you're talking about a Big 12 defensive player and you're talking top 10, even potentially top 5? There was a chance in this past draft he could have easily gone as high as number 2 to Houston. And again, you're talking about a Texas Tech defensive player. That doesn't happen a lot. Like I said, I got some familiarity with the Big 12. That doesn't happen that often.
Yeah, and Ndamukong Suh. I was trying to think of some of the guys way back in the day. Jordan Brooks was a first-round pick from Tech about 4 years ago by the Seahawks. Turned out to be a phenomenal. But he was kind of a late first, early second-round pick. But this was bona fide top 10. I mean, and I think people around the country are like, okay, he goes to Texas Tech. He's in the Big 12. How good could he be? But you look around. I mean, Bijan picked in the top 10, but Will McDonald from Iowa State picked in the top, in the top part of the draft. There was 6 first-round draft picks from the Big 12 conference, but I just think defense has gotten a lot better because they've adjusted to the way the football was played in this league, and you have to play in space because everybody was spreading it around, and everybody's got a mobile quarterback. And again, I think Tyree was a big piece because people try to put him in a box and okay, is he a defensive end? Is he a Russian? Is he a outside linebacker in a 3-4? What is he? He's technically all of those things, and that's kind of what you have to be in the Big 12 defensively these days. Like a lot of hybrid type guys. But I think like Max Crosby and obviously Chandler Jones will be phenomenal for him to kind of help bring Tyree along there in Vegas. But they got themselves just a quality dude, man. I can't say enough good things about him.
Yeah, and I'm excited. And you mentioned that versatility. And again, we're talking with Chris Level. We're talking all things Tyree Wilson. Chris is the host of Locked On Texas Tech. And, his versatility is something that GM Dave Ziegler, he every player that he drafted, they're all very versatile. But to be able to play that many positions along the defensive line, and to me, and I saw it from a distance, you saw it up close and personal, he looked really comfortable doing it.
Yeah, whether you stand him up, whether you put his hand on the ground, it doesn't really matter. You want to ask him to drop in coverage a little bit or get after the quarterback, and look, the knocks on Tyree, and these are fair. Does he play too high at times? Sure. When you're 6'6" plus, I mean does he play the run as well as he rushes the passer? No, he doesn't. But I mean, again, I think that he is good at it. He's just not elite at it or anything. And I think that the hand placement and some of those things, he would bite on a few, zone reads and some different things like that. I think there were some knocks, but again, he would make up for some of that because of his just motor and speed. And his arms, his wingspan is just unbelievable. I mean, this is just a really big person that looks like a, kind of like a power forward in basketball, but he's a football player all the way. And I think he will be able to help on special teams and doing some different things as well if that's the way they want to employ him. But yeah, very versatile. I just wouldn't put him in a certain spot and say this is what you are, because he could be a lot of different things in a defensive scheme.
I floated it out there a few times, Chris, that he could be out there with Max Crosby and Chandler Jones, right? Because
Absolutely.
He has the ability to be inside. Could you imagine those three guys, if you're on the defensive line, coming after the quarterback, even Patrick Mahomes, though, the Red Raider, right? The former Red Raider has to look at that like, wow, that is a hell of a package right there.
And I'll tell Raider fans, that's exactly what, when Tyree, after the draft, they're like, is there one quarterback you can't wait to sack? And that's the first name he mentioned. Patrick Mahomes. Right. And they said, do you have a message for Pat? And he's like, I think Tyree said, like, no, sir, no, I don't. I mean, he's just very matter of fact. Yeah. I loved it. And everybody around here loves Patrick, and great person, great quarterback, face of the league kind of guy. But Tyree won't feel sorry for him. He will try to get to him and get home often.
No, I have no doubt about it. I got an opportunity to talk to him a couple times, one day before the draft and then right after he got drafted. And you're right, he's not going to be a guy of a lot of words. He's not going to go into great detail on a lot of different things. But, man, he just seems like he's all business, and I really could respect that. And, one of the things also about him, a lot of Raider fans were saying, well, the Raiders had an opportunity to get Jalen Carter at number 7. Tyree Wilson's his off the field, his just reputation of a person, just who he is as a man. That's something that has to be talked about as well. I mean, he's just really a good dude in general.
Yeah. Other than the foot injury, right. There is zero baggage at all. This guy was a model citizen. And again, when I'm giving you that story a while ago about kind of policing the locker room, he's not trying to cause drama. He's trying to keep his teammates accountable and keep the standard very high on what we're trying to accomplish. But there's zero baggage there with this young man. Off the field, I think model student. I mean, there's just, and again, as you mentioned, he's not going to be real rah-rah. He's not going to, be interested in doing a lot of post-game media, because that's just not really who he is per se. But, I mean, he's all about business. You're right. He's a nice guy, too. I mean, he's a happy, smiles all the time, but that's just not his vibe. He doesn't mind not having the spotlight on him. He just wants to play ball, man.
Right. And, it's funny. He told me, it's like, hey, I was a Raider in high school. I'm a Red Raider in college, and there's an opportunity. Maybe I'll be a Las Vegas Raider. And then the next day, the Raiders select him. And so I talked and I said, I guess it was in the cards, right? So, I mean, he's basically been a Raider his whole life. I mean, obviously, he spent that time at Texas A&M, but a transfer in there, I guess he's been meant to be a Raider. And, Chris, there was also a story that Joey McGuire, and I got a lot of respect for Coach McGuire. He when he was on my radio show, he was saying that, there was a game against TCU where they were losing that game. They were going to lose that game. Him and the rest of the starters had already checked out, but TCU started driving. And Tyree said, hey, Coach, I got this. And he checked him and a couple of the other players back in and said, they are not getting in the end zone again. And they didn't. And matter of fact, Tech went down and scored a touchdown on the other end of things. But they still lost the game. But it's just one of those things, like Tyree has so much pride that even as a top 10 pick that he was already projected to be, he was ready to check himself back in the game because he just didn't want to see another score go up on the board for TCU.
Yeah, he also should have had his 8th sack in that game because there was a phantom face mask penalty called. He brings Max Duggan down. There's still not been a face mask touched by Tyree Wilson in that game. He got Max Duggan down clean as a whistle, and they throw a flag. So anyway, there should be we'll put an asterisk next to those 7 sacks on that. On that stat, but that's Joey summed up who Tyree is, man. His care factor is very high. Like, it matters to him. There are people that play this game that do it for the paycheck, or they do it to run out of the tunnel or whatever, and they've been gifted with a lot, and they're not really all in. But this is a guy. His care factor is through the roof. I mean, again. Who wants to do that and like go pull off somebody's name tag off of their locker and say they will come see me after practice because they needed to be out there or they should have practiced harder or whatever the case. I mean, I love that. That is culture. I mean,
Yes.
that is what you want. And coaches can't do that.
Right.
You know, I mean, it's got to come from your best player. And he was Texas Tech's best player.
I love it. I love that story. That is something right there that I'm going to tell anyone who wants to listen to. Anyone that's a nice little nugget right there on Tyree Wilson. And that's exactly, Chris, why I went to you, because I know that you got the nuggets. I know you've been covering not only Texas Tech, but the Big 12 for a long time. So you're going to have some good background and good insight about Tyree Wilson and a whole lot more. Well, man, this has been fantastic stuff. I definitely appreciate you. What do you got coming out on the show? What are you working on? I know spring ball just got wrapped up. Coach McGuire, I believe his wife is about to get married. What's going on the Texas Tech front right now that you kind of are keying in on?
Yeah, we've been talking about a lot about the Big 12. You know, there's reports about the Big 12's maybe playing some games in Mexico and things like that. And Joey's daughter is about to get married, Reagan, on May the 6th, I guess. But yeah, spring ball just wrapped up. We've got a new basketball coach here. He's trying to put a roster together. So a lot going on in Lubbock. It's still flat and windy here, but a lot of activity, man, in old Lubbock, Texas.
There's no doubt about it. They don't call it East Texas. It's Beast Texas, right? So
Yeah, that's right.
there you go. I'm not mad. Hey, Chris, thanks so much for your time, man. Great stuff. I definitely appreciate you.
Hey, Q, appreciate you having me on, man. Appreciate it.
There it is. There was the conversation right there. Chris Level, host of Locked On Texas Tech. Great stuff from him. Definitely have to catch up with him at some point throughout the regular season, kind of give him an update on how Tyree is doing and, give him his thoughts and get some more of his thoughts because, again, a fun conversation right there with Chris Level, so I definitely appreciate him. And that's going to do it for today's show. Coming up tomorrow, we're going to continue to do a deep dive on some of the players that the Raiders drafted and want to get into 7th-round pick Nesta Jade Silvera. So what I got coming up tomorrow, Chris Cartman from SunDevilSource.com. He's actually going to be part of my radio show later on this afternoon, and we're going to deep dive into all things Nesta Jade Silvera, the defensive tackle out of Arizona State by way of the Miami Hurricanes. Spent 4 years there in Miami and then transferred last season to Arizona State. And, of course, there's been a lot of, not controversy, but just conversation about who this guy really is. So I want to deep dive and get a better understanding because, as I've said multiple times on the show, I don't know who he is. I don't know him, as far as a lot about him. I've seen, video of him squirting Caleb Williams in the face with a water bottle in a playful way, but I don't really know too much about him. So I want to do a deep dive and, just get to know the player that is Nesta Jade Silvera. So that'll come up on tomorrow's show. We'll get back to more calls and texts. And, of course, we'll have news and notes around the league and, of course, news and notes around the silver and black. So that's going to do it for today's show. Again, thanks so much for making the show your first listen each and every day. We definitely appreciate that. And big ups to my man Ari at Ari Produces on Twitter, who has us up on YouTube each and every day. We definitely appreciate him. So until then, Raider Nation, take care of yourself, take care of your family, love on your family. Most importantly, as always, just win, baby.